Welcome, good afternoon. It's great to have you all back here at the Miller Center in my favorite format, sitting around a table, which is how this room was originally designed, and so we're really delighted to get to do this. In less than 3 weeks, on February 24th, we'll be marking the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In those 2 years, Russia appears to have deepened its partnership with China, as well as with Iran and North Korea. Russia's also hinted that it might use nuclear weapons. The US and allies in Europe, in Asia, have provided military and financial support for Ukraine and have even deepened and expanded their alliances. Yet both sides have faced economic, military, and political headwinds. So today we brought together two terrific panels to discuss how the world has changed in 2 years, if it has, and what the politics and future of the countries involved look like. We're going to look at the war over 2 years, what the US and our partners and allies have gotten right and gotten wrong about the war, how it's changed the international system, and what does the future of the war look like. And the second panel will look at leadership in the major countries involved in the conflict and how the leaders' choices and strategic directions will affect the future of the conflict. This second topic is particularly important here at the Miller Center, where we study the American presidency, so we all look forward to learning a lot over these two panels. For the past 2 years since the outset of the war, as most of you here in this room know, the Miller Center has been paying careful attention. We've had a weekly seminar of our scholars, not necessarily for public consumption, but where we've learned from one another across all of the global dimensions of the conflict, not just our experts on Russia and Ukraine, on European security, but also international economics and the broader geopolitics of the conflict. We've also hosted a half dozen events, both in person and by Zoom. And our scholars have used those sessions to inform their own writing, their own public speaking, and other public activities over the last 2 years. In many of these war room sessions, we've invited terrific guests, some of the leading thinkers from around the country, indeed around the world, to educate us, to inform us, and then to share ideas with us and hear from our own scholars of their views. So we've tried to do that today in each of these two panels. And in our first panel, I think we're all thrilled, but I'm particularly thrilled to be joined by Jim Steinberg, who is the Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies. He was Deputy Secretary of State from 2009 to 2012 under President Obama. He was Deputy National Security Advisor and also Director of Policy Planning at the State Department during the Clinton administration. And in full disclosure, he was my first boss in government, and I served under him in both of those jobs and learned a great deal from him. And we're also excited to have, as our kickoff speaker, as part of our kickoff duo on this first panel, Alexander Bick. Alex joins the University of Virginia's Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy as a professor of practice, having just served 3 years in the Biden administration's State Department Policy Planning staff and also National Security Council, where he was intimately involved in these kinds of questions. So they're going to kick off our conversation, and the format is that we have the same moderated roundtable that we do by Zoom every week. After initial remarks from Jim and Alex, we'll open the discussion to the table, literally and figuratively. And then following that, we'll take questions from the audience. For those of you here in the room, I think we have cards for you to write your questions on. For those joining us by Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll introduce the other participants as they join so that we don't have to introduce 12 people right now. As you'll see, their expertise, as I said before, covers military affairs, geopolitics, international economics, and in particular, we have a very strong group on East Asia. If you're watching at home, their biographies are available on the Miller Center website for this event. So thank you all once again for joining us, and we'll kick it off with Jim and Alex. So Jim, you've served at the highest levels of government. You have a second career in being an educator at some of the great universities in the country. Before Johns Hopkins, you were at Syracuse, and before that, the University of Texas. What have we learned from 2 years of war? What is the state of the world today? Is it much different than it was 2 years ago? What did we get right? What did we get wrong?
Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks for having me here at the Miller Center. I've had the privilege of being here many times over the years, and it's always a treat. And the work that you all do here is really important, because understanding our past is really important, not just understanding our present, but to think about the future. So great to be here and to be joined by so many friends and former colleagues around the table. It's a terrific group. So, the question is always, when you talk about these things, people pose, well, was this an inflection point? Is the world significantly different after than it was before? And as historians, this is where one always trots out the probably apocryphal aphorism attributed to Zhou Enlai, who was, when supposedly asked about the implications of the French Revolution, said, "It's too soon to tell." Now, it turns out that if he said this, he was actually thinking about the French Revolution in 1968 and not the one in 1789, so it was actually pretty too soon to tell. But it's an important reminder, because it's very difficult when you're in the middle of events to really fully appreciate the long-term implications. And I think, we now, for example, see World War I as an extraordinarily important turning point. But even in the first months of the war, people didn't see it that way and know it. And so I think there's a tendency, there's what we in the Academy call both type 1 and type 2 errors. We either overestimate and call it as an inflection point where it's really not so different, and occasionally we miss it completely, and there are events that we don't. So I think we have to be humble about thinking about the long-term consequences, and also to see the elements of continuity as well as the elements of change. But having said that, let me point to a few things that I do think are pretty consequential. One of which I think will come as no surprise, is that despite the effort through many administrations to try to change the centrality and the focus of American foreign policy and sort of see the kind of the central point of the world as being a conflict centered around Asia, that the world just doesn't allow this. And so, to take another example from kind of popular culture, it's a little bit like The Godfather. Just when you thought you got out, they pull you back in, right? And so, having felt, for a long time that Europe was relatively settled, that there were sort of minor conflicts that continued in the Balkans and elsewhere, that the center of gravity had moved to East Asia. It's clear that just isn't the case, and that the challenge is trying to just sort of have the privilege of privileging one set of problems and one set of geographies is not something that we can easily do, and that events have a way of imposing themselves on policymakers who would like a great deal of clarity. The second, I think, big question has been around the question about whether we are in a new era of ideology, right? I mean, that is, we kind of went from the moments in the immediate aftermath of the end of Cold War, where, again, not quite fairly characterized, our good friend and colleague, Frank Fukuyama, sort of assessment about the end of ideology, if not the end of history, as driving foreign policy, is that the question now becomes, is that more important? And we've seen a lot of debate about the question about whether the kind of one of the defining features of our world is democracy versus autocracy and the like. And I think there has been a recognition that, on the one hand, this is an important feature, and that some of the dividing lines that were sharpened by the Ukraine crisis was precisely between governments which were largely democratic and believed that what was at stake here was defense of basic principles about self-determination and democracy, versus those who had a different view. But also to recognize that even if there was an element of that to the lineup, as it were, in connection with this conflict, that a lot of countries didn't want to be pigeonholed one way or the other, and that many countries who were sort of nominally in the democratic camp, most obviously India, found it very hard to, resisted quite easily the temptation or the effort to kind of have it be defined in those ways. And similarly, countries which are not necessarily democratic have, for other reasons, been more aligned with the US and Western Europe. And so what we see is, at the core, there is an element of this. I mean, the strongest response to the intervention has come from the United States, from Europe, and from the democracies of East Asia, where I think we've seen a very strong response that perhaps surprised some people about how particularly Japan, but also Korea and others have responded to this, but also a recognition that there are a lot of countries in the middle which are nominally are democracies, Brazil, India, South Africa, which don't want to be brought into this alignment. And so, and even more, not only is it having both elements of this ideological divide and others, but it's also, it in some respects has become almost a self-fulfilling feature of the divide, because the more the issue gets defined this way and people are asked to choose sides, the more countries have found, if they don't want to choose sides, that they are being forced sort of into the other camp, because it's harder to sustain these relationships once they're being forced to make a choice. And this is most dramatically true in the case of China, where there was pressure at the outset for China to take a stand and to take a stand against this. And when China refused to do this, there's been a tendency, therefore, to kind of associate this. And so whatever the level of cooperation was between Russia and China before the conflict began, in some ways, by defining it this way, and China's unwillingness to separate itself from China, it's in some ways deepened the ties. The other thing that I think is very important, I think it's very hard to appreciate in the United States in particular, is that this attempt to define this as kind of a conflict between the rules-based order and those who don't, isn't going over very well in a lot of parts of the world, who are much more receptive to the argument that's been made by Russia and China that there's a lot of hypocrisy on the Western side about this, right? And so when we understandably want to define this as an act of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, in which countries, irrespective of their other things, should line up inside these principles, the words Iraq and Kosovo come out of people's mouths very quickly. And it is more problematic for us, I think, than we tend to give credit. That there is this view that that people invoke these principles in the rules-based order when it suits interests, but not in others. And I think that's part of the reason why, particularly in the parts of the world that don't want to line up directly on this autocracies versus democracy side, there is a tendency to do the what about thing and to sort of suggest that that this is not as principled a definition. And when Putin and the Chinese make the case that this is not as principled, they do get some resonance outside. The next thing, and I'll try to wrap this up pretty quickly here, is that we've learned a lot about the limits of deterrence and coercion as a result of these efforts. And it's something that I think we should have understood for a long time, which is that the idea that you can be effective in either deterrence or compellence while pulling your punches in terms of what you can do has proved deeply problematic. And the decision, for reasons which I'll touch on in just a second, where at the outset, the United States and our Western European partners indicated that we would be prepared to support but not engage directly in this conflict, basically seriously undercut both deterrence in the first instance and our ability to compel in the final instance. And of course, there are a number of reasons for this, some having to do with domestic politics and whether both Europe and Western Europe and the United States could get public support for sending their troops to fight and die in Ukraine, but also, and this is my last point, the renewed awareness of the salience of nuclear weapons, which has played an important part in addition to the lack of public support for direct military involvement by the United States and the rest of the conflict, to the very real sense in which the potential threat of nuclear escalation has caused us all to trim our sails fairly substantially in terms of what we're going to do. When you fight a war where you basically have ruled out taking it to the other guy's homeland, it really reduces your opportunities. So the combination of not willing to introduce our own troops and then not willing to take this directly to Moscow or to Russia itself in any meaningful way has really shown the limits of the ability to deter or compel, and including the limitations around economic measures to both deter and compel. So let me stop with that.
That's great. I know we're going to come back to you, Jim, on a lot of these points. So, Alex, you sign up to go work in the Biden administration. You have your first 6 months at the NSC. You're planning for a whole number of different things, including the drawdown in Afghanistan, which moves more quickly than you'd planned. And then suddenly you are looking at the possibility of a war in the middle of Europe. Walk us through all of that. And as you look back on it in 2 years later, what have you learned? What have we learned as a result of this?
Thanks. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to join the UVA community, which I've done just really in the last few weeks. So it's great to meet folks and see some familiar faces here as well. And just to state at the outset that my comments obviously are my own. They don't reflect the U.S. government's in any way. But I do think, to get to your question and to build a little bit on Jim always covers the waterfront, so it's a little difficult to find space in between his comments. But I want to say a little bit. Yeah, I believe it. So, I think when you asked the question, was this an inflection point? There's no question it was an inflection point for the administration. And I say that because, as you spelled out, there was an effort really to invest in the United States, the industrial capacity of the United States, technology, et cetera, to make America stronger, an emphasis on rebuilding our alliances around the world and our partnerships, and really preparing for the long-term struggle with China. And in a way, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is part of that story. It's part of taking our eye away from the challenges, as President Biden said many times, of 20 years ago, and putting them on the challenges of the future. And I think it's easy to lose sight of this, but the withdrawal from Afghanistan and our awareness that the Russians were contemplating an invasion of Ukraine are separated by only 6 or 8 weeks. The two crises come right on the heels of one another. And I think one of the primary lessons that many in the administration took from the Afghan experience is that there's a really important difference between operational planning, and in some cases contingency planning, and really being ready for a worst case. In the Afghanistan case, we were not ready for a withdrawal in a circumstance where the Taliban had taken Kabul before we left. That was just not something that we had seriously thought through. Many, many plans have been developed, but not for that situation. And when the intelligence came in on Russia's intent to launch a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, there was a commitment across the administration to not be in that same position again. And as a consequence, a lot of resources were put into planning that might not have been otherwise, I think. And so that's a lesson which predates the invasion itself, but I think has defined the way the administration has proceeded since then. I had the opportunity to lead some of that contingency planning for Russia's invasion, and really to have the time to devote and think about what was on the horizon, what it might look like, and what the implications would be strategically for the United States. And it's interesting in reflecting back, as I think we're all being asked to do here today, on some of the things that we got right and some of the things that we really didn't get right. And I think it points to a number of things. One is ways that the world change, or the change take place much more rapidly than you anticipate that it will. And in that sense, I do think this was an inflection point. But also the limits of our ability to predict the future. And that's a constant and important reminder, I think, for anybody who either aspires to be a policymaker or is doing it right now. So let me say a couple words about some of what we got right and some of what we got wrong. The first thing we got right is fundamentally we understood what the Russians were going to do militarily. We knew where they were going to attack, when they were going to attack, and essentially the outlines of their military strategy. And knowing that allowed us to warn, to build a coalition which was robust, to develop the kinds of cost imposition measures which we had been exceedingly slow, I should say the Obama administration had been exceedingly slow to impose in 2014 when Crimea was seized and the destabilization in the Donbass. Took months for sanctions packages to be rolled out. In this case, we wanted to prepare and be ready to go right from the beginning. And in a sense, that was consistent with, many of you will have heard President Biden say this, the idea that superpowers don't bluff. So if we were going to make these threats, we can come back to the question of deterrence and whether it succeeded or failed. But if a superpower was going to hold to its commitments, we needed to be prepared to levy significant costs right from the beginning. And that's where a lot of the planning effort went. We knew what some of the second-order consequences were going to be of the invasion. We were able to anticipate with relative clarity what the refugee flows were going to look like. We were able to think through and do a lot to support energy security in Europe in a way which made it much more difficult for the Russians to manipulate European politics, and it made it much easier for the Europeans to take measures which otherwise would have been very difficult for them to take. We got right some of the threats and capabilities that the Russians would deploy in terms of cyber. We haven't seen that explode into open view, and part of the reason we haven't seen that is because we did a lot in advance to make it much more difficult for the Russians to use that tool of coercion. And we saw some of the strategic challenges which Jim mentioned a few moments ago. We knew that this would probably drive Russia and China together. We knew that China would be watching closely to draw lessons for Taiwan. What was the international response going to look like? So we knew those were on the horizon. And I think by planning as we did and by getting these core elements right, we were in a position to build a much faster, more robust, more unified response than we otherwise would. I think that was instrumental in Ukraine's ability to hold Kiev. I think it was instrumental in Putin's inability to divide the Western alliance. And I think it ultimately meant that Vladimir Putin had to roll back some of his most ambitious plans and, without knowing the future, settle for something significantly less than he got if he gets anything out of this at all. That's the good side of the story. But the reality is, obviously, we got a lot wrong, too. And in many cases, what you get right or what you get wrong is more valuable to think about and dwell on than what you got right. So I think, as people know, we overestimated Russia's military capabilities. We underestimated the resolve and the capabilities of the Ukrainians. And we imagined a battlefield which, in a sense, might be solved in Russia's favor within a matter of weeks. And that had some important knock-on effects. It meant that we didn't think through the implications of a long war where industrial production would become extremely important. We didn't plan to turn on the American industrial base from day one. And in some ways, we're still, the administration is still working to try to accomplish that task. It meant that we underestimated, this is a separate point, but we underestimated the European response. There's a lot of hesitance in Europe to take the tough actions which we hoped that some of our allies would. But the moment that the Russian tanks and missiles began crossing the border, public opinion in Europe shifted very, very quickly, and governments across the continent were responding to citizens who were afraid, who were angry, and were asking their governments to do more to make sure that Russia would be stopped effectively in its tracks. We underestimated, and this is a point which Jim made very, very clearly, we underestimated the extent to which countries would hedge. It's not that we thought that everyone would line up immediately in condemnation of Russia, but the extent to which a number of countries were willing to pursue essentially an independent policy and remain mum took us a bit by surprise. So we worked very hard, the administration worked very hard to, in the original vote in the UN General Assembly, to get China to abstain as opposed to opposing a condemnation of Russia. That was successful. What we didn't anticipate is that Vietnam, India, and South Africa would also abstain. And their actions over the course of time, joined by some other states, some of them quite significant economically and politically, suggest that this middle is a middle which does not want to be manipulated by the larger powers. I'll just make two other points in this, and then I'll wrap up as well. I think we expected that Russia would compartmentalize on a few key issues. The idea that we would continue to negotiate, as we had been trying to with Russia on strategic stability, that was out the window. If Russia was going to invade a sovereign country, the idea of talking to them about the basis of strategic stability no longer made any sense. But on issues like arms control and the implementation of existing arms control commitments, our expectation was that the Russians would continue to have that conversation. Our expectation was that they would continue to put pressure on those states seeking nuclear weapons as part of a broader non-proliferation regime. I think both of those assumptions have proven either wrong or much weaker than we thought they would be. And this gets not only to the point that Putin has brought the use of nuclear weapons back into the strategic mix, but also that the architecture for controlling the use of and proliferation of those weapons essentially is gone. And I think that's one of the most important consequences, actually, that we'll take from this period. And then I'll just add one last one, which is food. I think anyone who's worked on Ukraine and Russia knows that Ukraine's largest export is wheat. Nobody would have denied that. And yet, and this is a confession, we never really thought through what the implications of that were once the war started. And as a consequence, we were relatively slow, although ultimately I think very successful, in pushing back against a food security crisis. And that had knock-on effects because those countries most directly affected by that food crisis are also some of the countries who had been caught in the middle and trying to make a determination of where they wanted strategically to fall. So just to kind of summarize, I think there are kind of 3 points that I take from this. The first is, as I've said, the caution that's required in predicting. Even an intelligence-driven, dedicated, relatively long-run planning process misses a lot that's really, really important. It's just a reality. The second is that the rate of change, I think it's an inflection point in the sense, not that it changed the direction of world events, but that it accelerated a number of underlying trends that were already there, but it made them move much more quickly. And if you look, for example, at the UK did an integrated strategic review before Russia's invasion. They did a revision of it about a year later. And what they found was they had all the vectors right, but they had taken for granted timelines of years where, in fact, things were moving in months. And I think if you looked at the U.S. national security strategy, you'd see similar, you'd be able to make a similar conclusion. And then the last one is, I think we underestimated bloc formation. The Biden administration came in with a strong commitment that we were not looking for a world of rigidly defined blocs. We wanted to create a world that was free, open, and transparent, a world in which we thought the United States would be well positioned, along with our allies and partners, to succeed. Not to force countries to choose, but instead to create choices for them, knowing that that would reduce the extent to which they were amenable or susceptible to coercion by other states. I think we have to accept at this point that those blocs are forming. And the question is, what will we do about that?
So typically, if we were in our Thursday morning war room, there would be 4 or 5 hands up in the little Zoom screens. I expect those hands will be coming at me, but I'll start with the first question, and then I'll be looking around the table here. I'm interested in this bloc formation and the way that both of you talked about it. On the one hand, particularly the big democracies, the big industrial democracies, have forged a tighter alliance and a bigger alliance with the addition, particularly of Sweden and Finland. And there have been some problematic players in that, like Hungary, but by and large, it's a stronger group. And then you've pointed to India, Brazil, South Africa in particular, but there are a lot of other developing country democracies. But tell us about that group, because on the one hand, they haven't lined up with the industrial democracies, but they haven't really fully lined up with Russia and China, or have they? How do they think of themselves now? Are they, as the phrase was developed, a third world, not in terms of economic development, but of political non-alignment? Or do they still think of themselves as democracies, just different kinds of democracies?
I mean, I think they think that's the wrong question, okay? And I think that's part of the reason why, which is that what's relevant to this case is that we believe, the United States, at least under President Biden, and I certainly believe personally, that the stakes here are deeply consequential. That this core principle underlying the UN Charter, that states don't invade other states, that people should have the right to self-determination, and that everybody has a stake in that. And what these other countries are saying is, no, we don't, right? I mean, this is just like we go back to the first Iraq War when, President the first President Bush said, the international community has to stand in this. And it seemed like that was a big principle. And all kinds of different countries, including at the time Russia and others, lined up to say, no, this will not stand. Right? And there are a lot of countries that say, well, it's complicated, and yes, they invaded, but then NATO enlarged. And these are all, and they're not deep matters of principle. And this is really just self-interest by states acting in a self-interested way. And so we don't feel like this deep principle is here. And by the way, you, the United States, when you feel like invading countries without the UN support, you do it too. And so they are not seeing it in a way that we see this as a defense of the rules-based international order and deep principle. They are accepting Russia and China's argument that this is just states acting in their self-interest, and this is about the United States, which has these self-interested reasons for doing it. And so I think that's why the challenge, we have had this problem of trying to mobilize broader international opinion, is that sense of a principle being at stake here is deeply felt in Western Europe, except with the exception of Hungary and one or two others. It is deeply felt in some of the more established democracies in East Asia, including Australia, but that others who are nominally democratic don't see it being about democracy. They see it about the way they think the international system works, and don't buy this idea that it's about the rules-based order.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that, I would not overstate the extent to which countries are not committed to the UN Charter. I mean, I think the idea of territorial sovereignty has been the one point that resonates pretty much everywhere. And the question is whether Russia's attack was provoked or not provoked. And if you believe that it was an unprovoked attack, then you're more likely to be critical of Russia. If you believe that, as many in South Africa do, for example, that it was a response to NATO enlargement and a disrespecting of Russia's security, then you see that problem in a different way. But I don't think the commitment to those principles is necessarily as weak as you've described it.
It's more that the claim that we have of the moral high ground on this is one that is not accepted by these countries that are kind of resisting. That's, I guess, the point.
Yeah, and the second point I make is, I think these countries want flexibility. They want to be able to cooperate with the United States in certain areas and cooperate with China in others, while maintaining, in some cases, a relationship with Russia. That not only gives them strategic flexibility, it also gives them the ability to play us off one another and extract concessions or get attention to issues that are important to them. There are elements of that are consistent with the non-aligned movement in the 1960s, but now you're talking about big countries with big economies that collectively probably make up about 25% of world GDP. It's a very different situation than we had 50 years ago.
So I'm keeping names, and John Owen's hand went up first. I'll call on John, and then Mara, and then Dale. John Owen is joining us from the UK, where he's on sabbatical. He's a professor in our politics department, and he has a new book out on the liberal world order. So John, please fire away.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you for accommodating me, by the way. I'm in England, and guess what? It's dark and rainy. But I want to talk about Europe a little bit more, or get Jim and Alex and others to talk a little bit about Europe, because I'm over here. This is partly a self-indulgent question. I just spent a long weekend in Berlin, too, so I'm thinking about that important country. And recently, a German group asked me to write an essay on the implications of European security and transatlantic relations of the 2024, our presidential election coming up in November. So all that's a segue into asking, I wonder if Jim and Alex would care to talk about the potential inflection point for transatlantic relations, European security. So I'll set it up as follows, and some of the points have already been made. So far, the big story about transatlantic relations is NATO is bigger and stronger, more solid. The talk of a brain-dead NATO is gone. That was Emmanuel Macron's phrase a few years ago. And the reasons are pretty obvious, but there's nothing like being over here and seeing it. The Brits are very solidly with Ukraine. This is bipartisan, so Sunak's government, conservative government, is not going to last too much longer, it appears. But Keir Starmer's Labour Party appears equally determined to oppose Russia in Ukraine. In Germany, you know, the discourse is different, but there's enormous solidarity with Ukrainian flags flying from all sorts of buildings. And of course, the U.S. support has been essential to Ukraine, and Europeans are grateful for it. And Sweden and Finland have joined, and so on. So that's familiar ground. I assume people in the room are familiar with all that. So we could say so far there is, if anything, a sort of bloc solidification going on with Japan and Korea and Australia, New Zealand, and so on, for better or worse. But I wanted to raise the possibility that this could be a short to medium term phenomenon. And I say that because the Europeans really are concerned about a couple of things. They're concerned about a Trump victory. They take seriously Donald Trump's skepticism about NATO. Maybe they take it too seriously. But they remember quite vividly in the first Trump administration, and they're anticipating what a second one, if it happens, would mean for them. They read the same media we do, and they may exaggerate. Their fears may be exaggerated. I don't know. But they also are, in fact, increasing their military spending a bit slower than we would like. But finally, Europeans agree that the peace dividend era is over. The Germans call this the Zeitenwende. It's time to spend more, and it's happening slowly. Stands to reason the more Europeans spend on their own military, the less they actually need the United States, the less the United States needs to defend Europe. So I wonder, because a lot of Europeans are wondering about this, I wonder what our Alex and Jim think about this. Is there some chance we would look back on this as actually, ironically, the beginning of a kind of transatlantic decoupling? Or do you think that's really an overblown fear by some Europeans? Thanks.
So it's a great question, and I think there are two elements to try to answer that. I mean, because lots of events are happening at the same time, and so there's definitely been a greater cohesion among particularly Western European countries, but also, as I mentioned, Japan, Korea, and others around this. But it also, I think, has to be seen in conjunction with the evolution of views about China. And so part of what's driven the United States and Europe together is common views on Ukraine. But as European views about China have gotten much darker, and the sense that you can do things with China and it's okay, and there was a disjunction between the United States and Europe for a number of years as the U.S. line got harder and harder, but Europe still wanted to keep the lines going. That's, as you probably see over there, is gone in a big way. I mean, there's not a lot of, and so Europe we have parallel diagnoses both about Russia and China now, and equally important for Europe, because of the U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China and particularly the technology competition, Europe wants to be with us on this. And so there's a powerful incentive, both in terms of the security environment, but also the techno-economic environment for this community to get stronger. And so the two things, I think, combine to bring us together and are bigger than just the Ukraine crisis. Having said that, you also put your finger on the other side, which is that every European and every other country in the world, and I get to travel around the world a lot, are hedging their bets right now because they don't know what's going to happen in November. They saw what happened before. And there's still, as much as there's sort of a sense of the moment of cohesion and common enterprise, there's still people talking about strategic autonomy. And how do we live in a world where we might have to make it on our own, both vis-a-vis Ukraine and other things, on trade and economics and the other things. And so we are in this funny moment in which one could imagine things changing very dramatically in November, and the auguries around the current congressional debate about Ukraine is deepening that sense about the need to have a plan B, even though the clear first choice at the moment, I think, is a deepening of the transatlantic relationship.
I agree with all those points. I mean, I think to ask the question about a Trump administration is to put the causal variable in a different place, right? I mean, if the question is the consequences of the war and the 2 years since, I think those take you in the direction of Jim's answer. If you look at the question of the implications of a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, I think that's different, and I think you should disentangle the two of them. The only other element I'd add is if you look country by country, there are reasons why I think this relationship will endure that are more structural. The UK now needs the United States, if it didn't before, because of its exit from the EU. Its ability to project power globally is now fundamentally dependent on the U.S., again, if it wasn't already. We can put a question mark on Germany, but there are some very interesting statistics that are coming out now that that China's trade with Germany has now dipped below its level of trade with Russia. It's quite remarkable, and that's because of a tenfold increase in China's relationship, economic trade with Russia, not so much because of a decrease on the German side. And then as the war has brought security concerns to the forefront in Poland and obviously for Ukraine, the center of gravity, I think, within the NATO alliance has shifted eastward in a way which privileges states which traditionally have looked at the relationship with the United States as fundamental to their security. So I think there are a number of these other structural factors, if you go country by country, which suggest these trends will endure.
Great. Next is Mara Rudman. Mara has just joined the Miller Center in September as our Schlesinger Distinguished Professor, having served in the Obama administration as a Middle East peace negotiator, and before that in the Clinton administration at the NSC.
With Jim Steinberg, coming full circle. I want to pick up on your last point, Alex, and put a question, I think, because it goes to Jim, what you were saying when you mentioned what the first Bush administration did very effectively and how they did it. And part of what's troubled me through a number of comments here is, I think, a challenge the United States has had across administrations on knowing our adversaries and, frankly, doing what in business terms would be a stakeholder analysis of knowing where different people are and why they're there and what our plan is for moving them. And I actually don't think it's about principles, about democracy or autocracy. I don't mean to sound unprincipled about it. But what I'd be curious about, and I'm going to put Eric on the spot too in terms of the first Bush administration, because my assumption in studying that from outside was that was an example of really savvy statecraft and of smart politics on international stage. And that element seems to me goes up and down in administrations to follow on how effective they are in doing that. But Alex, some of the points you made about not even understanding Russia fully, never mind understanding where different countries are going to come at this, and Jim, you made this point, to me points to a gap, and I think it's across administrations, Democratic and Republican, in basic, whether you call it politics or knowing, figuring out where different people are on different things. And so I'd be curious kind of your take on that, and Eric, from having lived it inside the Bush administrations.
I may need help from Steve. Moral support, if nothing else. I will be happy to answer that if you want. I think it's actually a very important
So this is Eric,
point.
for those who don't know, Eric Edelman is a practitioner, senior fellow here at the Miller Center, has served as ambassador to Turkey and Finland, and Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
The point I was going to make is that I do think it highlights what Mara was pointing to, a difference in approaches to multilateralism. So the Bush 41 administration was very successful at putting together a multilateral coalition and getting them to basically pay for the war. But that was enabled by the willingness to say, if you don't join us, we're going to go alone. And that, I think, is frequently missing when we put together multilateral coalitions. I mean, if you're trying to put together a multilateral coalition and you say to people, well, if you don't join us, we might not, go or do anything, I think it begins to undermine your ability to get people to go with you.
I think on the point of knowing the adversary, essentially, is what I take your point to be. Look, a lot of people who have studied Russia for decades underestimated Putin's interest in taking this path. And I think in some ways some of the people who knew Russia best were the most surprised. So there's a tension. I think my experience in the U.S. Government, both in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, is that those people who have a degree of expertise and strategic empathy sufficient to really put themselves in the shoes of other actors gives them a leg up on anticipating. But expertise can be baggage. And in this particular case, in retrospect, all the signs were there. In a sense, Putin has been threatening to do this for 20 years. And yet, we fundamentally had trouble believing he would do it, in part because it was such an outrageous thing to do, and in part because the political logic was so weak. The idea that the Russians would be able to go in, topple the government, and easily occupy a country of 40 million people, in fact, was a bad plan. And as we were trying to evaluate, is he really going to go forward with this? And again, I'll bring in the Afghanistan example because I think it's really, really important. In the Afghanistan case, the intelligence had been very clear that the Taliban were gaining ground, but also very clear that they were not likely to take Kabul within the window of time that we were looking at. And so coming out of that experience, developed a kind of skepticism within the senior leadership in the Biden administration that we could rely on intelligence alone, that it was really important to use common sense and creativity in thinking about it. And the common sense answer to would Putin invade was no.
So just to add on both Mara and Eric's really good points, I mean, I think, and this has been kind of one of the messages I want to hear, so I think, I wasn't inside obviously, is that there was a belief that the principled violation here would be enough to organize the international community. I think there was even a sense that maybe even Russia, I mean, even China would say, because China believes so deeply in the importance of sovereignty and is always making these articles, that countries would say, well, it's a no-brainer. They violated, it is Article 2.4, Article, you don't do this, it's what the Charter is all about, and therefore everybody would fall into line. And I think the lesson here was that it's not enough, and that you have to do the transactional work that's both the diplomacy and the transactional stuff. When you say to countries that have economic relations with Russia or going to get cheap oil from Russia, that you have to do that too. And that you can't count on the principles of the rules-based international order for everything. Oh yes, we believe in that. And because again, I mean, part of it is because people question our legitimacy, which I don't share, by the way. I want to make clear. The fact that I'm reflecting this doesn't mean it's my view, but part of it is that they just didn't make the same diagnosis, that the facts spoke for themselves, that this was a violation of international law and that everybody should stand up. But even those who might quietly say, oh yeah, right, you still had to deal with the transactional side. And we haven't mentioned other important countries that didn't line up, and they were in the Gulf. Right? I mean, it wasn't just India, it was also the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others. And so an important part of the story here, which is that, and again, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have made the principled argument that this is important for world order, that people don't just feel free to invade other countries. I read an article in one of these blogs around now that says, well, maybe this was all wrong, and that outlawry and, the Kellogg brand was a terrible mistake, and we should let people go to war. Well, I don't think that's right. But we also, it's not enough to rely on the principle speaking for itself to think that countries are going to rally to your side.
Just an important clarification, more than 140 countries did condemn Russia's invasion. So, I mean, it was not, we were surprised by specific cases, and obviously you want that number to be as high as you can get it. 140, I think it was 144, isn't bad. And some of those countries in the Gulf you've just mentioned were part of that 140. Their actions subsequently have been more complex.
Bill,
Tom Graham wants to get in. Tom will be the anchor of our next panel, joining us from the Council on Foreign Relations, and a career diplomat who served in administrations, but most recently in the Bush White House.
Right, and I just wanted to build on what Alex has said about knowing your adversary. Okay, and just very quickly on this. I was one of those Russia experts that got it wrong. But the problem is not so much the expertise, but become victims of our contacts on the Russian side. Almost everybody that we talked to in the run-up to February 24th told us this wasn't going to happen. It made no sense, it made no logic, based on their soundings in and around the Kremlin, they did not think this was going to happen. People inside the Kremlin didn't think this was going to happen. People at the foreign ministry didn't think this was happening. So the judgment was a reflection of what we were picking up from our contacts on the Russian side. What we failed to factor in is that these people weren't in the decision-making loop. And so we were as surprised as they were by what happened on
Eric
February
wants to jump
24th.
in on this point, and then we're going to go to Dale Copeland.
Yeah, I want to point out that Tom and I served in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow at the same time.
Well, no, this was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. Tom's points, I think, highlight something Mara said, which is it's fine to talk to a lot of people in Moscow, but in a personalistic system where only one person matters, one always has to have a little bit of humility about knowing whether you can crawl inside his head or not.
I want to bring in Dale Copeland. Dale is a professor in our politics department here. He focuses on world order, international relations theory, but particularly with a new book out on how economics affects international trade, financial flows affects geopolitics.
Thanks, Bill. And I have the advantage of having to teach in 10 minutes, so I can ask a controversial question and then leave. But in fact, as Bill knows, I like to sort of mix things up or challenge the perspectives. And I want to go after some of Jim's points about inflection points and a shift towards Europe. I actually think if you think about it deeply, there's actually less change geopolitically in the big structural factors than we would have expected. I think we forget that prior to 2022, we were all talking about a new Cold War. We were talking about US and China perhaps having conflicts in many different places, especially with the BRI extending itself. But what's interesting to me is the following few things. First of all, there hasn't been a major decoupling in the economy. So in that sense, we haven't seen major economic warfare, let alone actual conflicts. And we've seen China, at least recently, backing off of the wolf warrior diplomacy. So here's what I would say is, I don't think there's been a big geopolitical shift. There's been a skirmish, if you will, but the big game is still China versus the US. And here's what I think is the implications are. It's an inflection point, but in a potentially good way, which is that China has learned some lessons from this and is actually realizing that the more one pushes, especially if it's perceived in a glory-driven way, the more one looks like one of those old authoritarian states that wants to take over the world, and the more one gets balancing against you, including your neighbors like Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So China is smartly backing away from some of that to avoid getting constricted, especially economically, the way Russia has. The other aspect of this, and I'll just be short because I do have to leave, is that if we think of this as an emerging bipolar system where Russia is kind of a smaller player, maybe aligned with China, what does China get out of this? China doesn't really want this to continue because it's hurting its Belt Road Initiative in Central Asia, its linkages by rail to Europe's trade. Europe and US are the big trading partners, 10 times as much trade than with Russia. So what China would like to see is it end and get back to some kind of growth of the economy to help China's domestic stability. So ironically, I think the US is in a better position now. It's formed an anti-China chip alliance, semiconductors. It's got a better presence now in Asia. China's backing off of the threat to invade Taiwan, at least immediately. So again, the context matters. If prior to 2022 we were talking about a new Cold War and Hal Brands was talking about the coming conflict with China, I actually think that's now wrong. And in fact, we've actually improved our relationship, ironically. Avoid the Pelosi question to a year and a half ago, and look at what's happened recently. And we're in a more stable geopolitical situation. Not quite détente, not quite peaceful coexistence, but I think China has a self-interest, as the US does, to avoid that new Cold War. Thanks.
Jim, I'd love your reaction to
sure.
that, and then also maybe bring in Harry and
Get
Shirley.
Harry's view would be great too. So I have to say, with respect to Al, I worry that that's wishful thinking on your part, which is I think we think if we were China that we would want the war to end for the reasons that you said. But I'm not sure that that's actually the way the leadership in China sees it. I mean, and I think that's been part of the problem, is I think that from the beginning, we could tell ourselves a story about why this was not in China's interest. And it's not crazy. I mean, I think that, if I were there, that's what I would do. But I actually don't see signs of that. And I think, from talking to people who know, there's a tremendous amount of support from China for what's going on in Russia, and no significant effort by China to end this war, right? I mean, because they could, if they wanted to, they have a lot of leverage that they could exert. I'd be interested in Tom's and Eric's view on this, but I've always believed that if Xi Jinping really wanted this to end, he would tell his friend Vladimir Putin, it's time for this to end, and it would actually have a big impact. So I'm not so sure that that's right. And I'm also not so sure that, I mean, there's no question that China is making an effort to stabilize U.S.-China relations. But don't tell that to the Philippines. And look at the South Thomas, the second Thomas Shoal. Don't look at some of these other places. And so I think I'm very careful about, you could be right, but it's hard to know about whether there's been a significant rethinking about China's overall strategy. There are people I respect who know China who have a different view, and some who have your view, and I have my own, and it's spent a lot of time there. So I think we don't know at this point, and I think but it's easier to say what the policy implication is. We should do the things that we can do to make it more likely that China's going to move in that direction without basing our policy on the assumption that they've made the calculus that you've just described.
I want to bring Shirley and Harry into this, but I have a quick, small follow-up. Jim, you went on a delegation after the recent Taiwanese elections to congratulate them for having a successful election. And I'm curious how much on those visits people were talking about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine.
Not. I mean, I think that there obviously, it's not trivial or irrelevant to think about the two, but I think, the Taiwanese are very pragmatic about this, and Harry, surely I could say this, is that they understand that whatever choices we make about Ukraine aren't really going to decide about what the choices we make about China and Taiwan. And so I think they gain neither comfort from the fact that we were involved and we did economic sanctions, nor excessive fear because we didn't intervene directly militarily to draw the conclusions there. I think they are looking at their unique set of circumstances and their unique situation and largely drawing the conclusions and trying to read the tea leaves about U.S. politics and our overall relationship with China as a measure of how we will respond in the event that things become more difficult across the straits.
Mm-hmm. Harry and Shirley, so has the war in Ukraine been an inflection point, particularly in U.S. relations with China?
Can I go first, Harry?
Okay, so Shirley Lynn is a professor of practice here at the Miller Center.
Taiwan does have some very deep interest in what's happening in Ukraine, and I'll let Shirley talk about that.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill. Actually, I very much was going to say something else to respond to Dale right away, but let me respond to Jim right away because we just came from Taipei literally 5 days ago, and I came via Bangkok to one of the largest Asian conferences with 1,500 people focusing on public health. And what I want to say is, Dale, unfortunately, I agree with Jim. Actually, not much has changed, and that is the Chinese are very successful. Actually, they're not backing off. I think, again, what Jim was saying about timeline, backing off is the wrong way to look at it. They're highly successful. In fact, the Taiwanese decided to hedge, as all of you were talking about, by giving actually the parliament to the KMT, the pro-Beijing party. Think about any country that needs the United States more militarily. There is no country that is talking about, and I guess, Jim, I just want to correct this in terms of the presidential election in Taiwan on January 13th. Every single presidential election talked about Ukraine during the debate before the day you got there. Once you got there, it was already decided. But during the debate, everybody was talking about Ukraine, and the same facts presented to the opposition, both somewhat pro-China parties, which won actually together a majority in the parliament, and that's what the Taiwanese decided to do. Give the parliament actually more pro-China, actually parliamentarians, and voted for the more anti-China president. And this is a situation, I think, that's very disconcerting for the United States. It's not about the big D democracy. In fact, the reason Ukraine is so important, of course, is the fear of abandonment, the fear that actually the United States, in the end, is going to be losing the world. And therefore, if that's the case, this giant neighbor next to this little island, should we be putting all the eggs in that basket called democracy when democracy can't save you? And accommodation then becomes the only solution, because you know that no matter how much you put, whether it's 3% or 4% of your GDP in defense, if in 20 years there is no choice but China, what do you do now? And so I think this is a big issue for the United States to convince those about democracy. And democracy, I think today sounds like the most self-serving kind of governance system, actually. And this is something that Taiwanese think a lot about, Dale, in terms of, is the CHIP Act successful? I think most people on the island are very doubtful. Most people think that, decoupling happened because it served the United States. After so many decades of integrating with the global economy, suddenly we want China out. And it's at the expense of Asian economies that are highly innovative, highly productive. And I think this issue of the big democracy versus a small one is where China is very successful, and China simply needs to, as the underdog, sow doubt. It doesn't need to be successful in creating a narrative. It just has to say, what about ism? What about Afghanistan? What about Ukraine? That's what Taiwanese will do. So 2 of the 3 presidential candidates in Taiwan's national election this time talked incessantly about Taiwanese kids going to war, so we'll end up being Ukraine, and the United States will never get here. And so it's just our problem to resolve. And I think that's why the voters decided, let's split up the government. Some pro-China, some pro-the US, and we're going to keep them all in the balance just in case nothing goes right. And I think this is what's very, very worrisome about what's happening. And the second point is on functional line on representing the South. India and China now are all out on representing the South. The United States is nowhere near this. And I think this is very important because I came from the biggest conference in Asia, Prince Mahadal Award Conference, which has been going on for a long time in Bangkok, where the UN is. Multilateralism is completely basically in doubt, and everybody was talking about where is the United States during COVID. And Singapore nominated the keynote speaker, of course, very well-known speaker, Mahbubani, who spoke about 2 elephants trampling all over the fields of Asia. And he talked only about 1 elephant, and that was the United States, and what is wrong with the United States. So when he finished speaking, the United States representatives all stood there and thought, I think they were supposed to get up and leave the conference, but it was too hard because it was so big, and so they didn't leave. But during lunch, everybody is saying, how can Singapore just nominate him to talk about this in a public health conference, which the heading was geopolitics and public health. And the entire 3-day session was basically, the United States cannot be trusted. This is out, open, public, in a city where the United Nations is based. And I thought it was just terribly embarrassing. And of course, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan had altogether not even 10 representatives. The Southeast Asians were there looking at this, and I think that everyone understands, if you want to get economic subsidies, you call Beijing, and they will be right there. They were all over the conference, and you know whom to call. There's a number to call directly. So I think functionally, in terms of special areas, whether it's public health or it's economic development, China is to be dependent on. And in terms of geopolitics, all you have to do is worry. And all you have to do is look at the United States record over the last 70 years. The Taiwanese will be the first to say we've been abandoned many times. And so how do you know it's not our turn next? So we don't want to be Ukraine. I think these are things that really matter during the national election. Harry?
Well, there's so many things that I could say at this point, and I know you all want me to talk about China. Maybe I'll do that later. But I want to get back to this idea of the inflection point, because I think there are inflection points happening. And there are 2 groups of them, maybe many more. But the ones that I want to talk about just quite briefly are inflection points in terms of old assumptions being very sharply questioned, if not discredited, and ideas, conversely, that we thought were kind of completely obsolete beginning to come back. And let me talk about the ones that are coming back first. Obviously, the most important one is the idea that the possibility of war in Europe and perhaps in other parts of the world was becoming increasingly unlikely. And I think that we're now beginning to question that. There is the possibility of war among major powers. I think that there will be efforts by the nuclear powers to avoid, obviously, going nuclear. Whether they will succeed or not, I don't know. But I'm not sure that that is going to make other kinds of conflict impossible. And in particular, I think that then the assumption that we also have to question, the new assumption, is that war will be conducted by military forces. This is the big problem in thinking about Taiwan. So much ink is being spilled on what's going to happen if the People's Liberation Army invades Taiwan. They are not going to invade Taiwan because they're not going to want to have to invade Taiwan. They're going to try to discredit the United States and to basically cause enough doubt and uncertainty and anxiety in Taiwan that Taiwan will basically be willing, for lack of an alternative, to make some kind of deal with the mainland. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know. But rather than worrying about what's going to happen if a flotilla of Chinese invasion forces comes across the Taiwan Strait, will they be able to land? Will the Americans be able to in any way interdict? Will the Taiwanese be able to do that? What we ought to be thinking about is a new kind of warfare. Everything from trying to disrupt Wi-Fi and communications from one country to another, the question of disrupting flows of energy to Taiwan, and disrupting basically the coherence of a government and the popular support. So I think there's going to be new kinds of warfare, new kinds of pressure, and certainly in discussions of the Taiwan Strait situation, there's been too much old strategy and too little new strategies. So that's one thing that I think has to be questioned. The other I want to talk about is some old ideas and emotions that are coming back. And kind of going back to basically some of the traditional French language of diplomacy. I think that we are seeing, first of all, the power of irredentism, the power of lost territory. That, of course, is the essence of the Russian problem with Ukraine, why they're so angry that it's become a separate state when they think it should be part of a greater Russia, and it's obviously China's problem with regard to Taiwan. This is lost territory, and territory remains a very, very powerful emotion in international affairs. And I think that those who thought that that had kind of gone with the end of the 19th century are having to rethink all of that. The other and even more powerful emotion, and again, a kind of a term from the French, I believe, is the idea of revanchism, revenge. And I think that this is the essence of much of how the Chinese think, much of how the Russians think, and how especially now what we call the Global South thinks. That basically they feel that they have been disrespected, have been basically in terms of economics, they have been discriminated against, they've been exploited. And they want to sort of set the record straight. And to have some kind of reckoning with the global north. Now, as Shirley has just said, the global south itself is not clearly organized yet. Some progress they think is being made, but it's going to be a battle, as Shirley has said, between India and China as to who is going to lead it. The Indians are going to be very powerfully arguing that China is not going to lead the global south because it's not part of the global south. China is part of the global north, they will argue, in terms of its level of development and above all its the fact that it holds more sovereign debt of other countries than any country in the world. It is a so-called southern country, China, that holds sovereign debt. And from countries especially that have participated in the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I'm trying to say is a couple of things. First of all, yes, I think there is a kind of a change in the time, a Zeitwende, that a large part of it is the structure of the international system. I think that we've already talked about the way in which old assumptions and old institutions are beginning to be challenged as being either out of date or being dishonored or not being effective. But in addition to that, I think we're seeing new cleavages. And the one that I'm particularly interested in, the idea that while the East-West conflict is not completely over, the new one is the North-South one. And that is basically also seeing this idea of the South developing countries feeling that they have been the victims of a variety of economic ties and dependencies, and they want to see that aspect of their situation revised both from a historical point of view, maybe not formal reparations, but the idea that they need to have a better economic stake in the global economy. I'll just leave it at that. If you want more about China, we can talk about that later,
Great.
perhaps.
Thank you, Harry. We only have a few minutes left, so I want to turn back to Jim and Alex for closing thoughts. A lot of ideas on the table here, particularly as the conversation just shifted back to where the U.S. government wanted to shift the conversation to Asia. And I'm curious to get your sense of how this plays out forward in a couple minutes. While the war is still raging on or stalled and hot at the same time in Ukraine, and the U.S. is fighting for support, do we have a credible position vis-a-vis China? And Alex, as the administration thinks forward about what it might do in a second term, or what a Trump administration might do in a second term, second Trump term, how should we think about those things?
I mean, I do think it's very difficult to answer these questions in February of 2024, right? Because I think that, you have a set of strategies. I mean, I have a slightly different take from Shirley on this, which is I think that most of the focus that I heard was on Trump. I mean, it wasn't on Ukraine. It was what was this going to be? And that was the great preoccupation when I was there, is what does this mean for us?
Jim, you got there after the election was
Okay,
over.
fair enough. But because as you said, and of course you're always right, that the idea, the only thing that matters to them is what will the U.S. do vis-a-vis Taiwan, and that's my point. Is that we could have done everything in the world for Ukraine, and it wouldn't have made the people in Taiwan feel more secure, because they still would worry about what we would do for Taiwan. I mean, they have that in that sense. I think it's always about us, right? And the history of abandonment, and everybody remembers all that stuff. And so any of these. I mean, as I travel around the world, I mean, everybody's hedging their bets, right? There's just this massive bet hedging going on around the world because we are incredibly consequential, but nobody has any confidence that they know where this is going to go, right? And so you have this, tremendous level of international uncertainty right now, because in all three of the major theaters that we're focusing on, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Middle East, or whether it's East Asia, what we do isn't fully determinative, but it will have a huge impact, right? So we're in this, whether it's an inflection point, it's a moment of maximum uncertainty. And there's sort of, obviously it's not just about our election. Even if Biden's reelected, there are underlying forces that still have to be contended with. But we're in this kind of 9-month, 10-month-long breath-holding exercise globally that makes sort of everybody sort of think about how do we get through this period of time and how do we prepare for it. And it goes back to our earlier conversation about Europe. I think Europeans would like to be in a place where this re-engagement with the United States is part of the strategy, but also don't want to make big bets right now on how to do that. And I think the world is doing this, and we see this in the Gulf and in the Middle East, right, where countries trying to decide, how much can you rely on this? And we're trying to get the Gulf states to take our side against China and be part of that competition, and they're making the same kind of calculus that the people in Taiwan are being, which is, well, we don't want to be left out and hang out to dry. And so I think it's very difficult right now, either as an analyst or a policymaker, to try to figure out what you do when everybody is just simply anxious and feels like choices are going to be made about them that are enormously consequential for them, over which they have no direct say.
I can't add too much to that, only on the point of uncertainty. I think that's a really crucial point. And it makes me think of the John Kenneth Galbraith BBC series and then book that came out, I think, in 1970, called The Age of Uncertainty, where he wrote essentially that all these major defining ideas of the previous half century essentially had all collapsed at once. And he was speaking specifically about economic ideas, but I think it applies now. Our confidence in the overall trend lines on democracy, on America's role in the world, on technology as a force for good, you can itemize these. I think our confidence in all of those things has decreased pretty dramatically. And as we look at a world that's more uncertain, at a world that's more contested, I think it makes it all that much more important to think creatively about what's over the horizon. And some of that work is beginning in the U.S. government in a way and with a renewed energy that wasn't there before. And I think that's a very positive thing. In terms of sort of, where are we and where do we go? I think this conversation has given good reason, or certainly good evidence for a degree of pessimism. But I also think you can come away with some fairly important conclusions which are not quite so pessimistic. And so maybe we can end with those. One of which is, we feared that Ukraine would be wiped off the map 2 years ago now. The expectation was that the Ukrainian government would hold on for a few weeks, that Russia would install a puppet leadership, that it would face a difficult insurgency, but that Ukrainian independence, as we had previously known it, would be over. That's not the case today. Ukraine is under tremendous strain, but they are a sovereign, democratic government that continues to hold the vast majority of their territory, although obviously not all of it. Our position vis-a-vis China, despite all of the challenges and despite the thorny problem of Taiwan, our overall position vis-a-vis China is stronger, I believe, today than it was 2 years ago, because of the feeling among many of our allies that U.S. intelligence and U.S. power were ultimately essential to their own security. And I think because China has seen some of the difficulties that Russia has gone through, and they've taken advantage of that, obviously, I think that puts us ultimately in a slightly better position. Our alliances are stronger now than they were before. And I think the trend line on a kind of multipolar world and countries in the so-called global south, a kind of revanchist attitude. Look, Putin went out in 2007 and said we need a multipolar world. The feeling in a country like Brazil that the United States has not been supporting its best interests is not a new feeling. It is a deep-seated feeling in the Brazilian elite that goes back decades, and it's true for many other countries in the world. Those are not new problems. I think what the Ukraine crisis clarified was that those feelings were going to be consequential for America in the long term. And it's given us an opportunity to actually begin addressing some of those issues to some extent. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, but through different kinds of assistance programs, through different kinds of multilateral diplomacy, through a variable geometry of working with different states to do different things, there are a number of steps that are afoot that are designed essentially to limit the extent to which that revanchist attitude displaces cooperation with America in a number of areas where we want to cooperate with many, many countries around the world. So I put some chits on the positive side of the ledger.
Well, I want to thank all of our participants, but particularly Jim and Alex for leading us in a really, really terrific conversation. I think we've looked at the structure of geopolitics, international security, and touched on international economics. And our next conversation will take us to some of the personalities involved and how these key leaders have made decisions, made calculations, choices, and what lies ahead for them and then for all of us. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break and come back right at the top of the hour. But until then, I do want to thank Jim and Alex in particular for kicking us off. Really
У нас с Андроником почти одна кровь.
I think there's a couple people that didn't get in the conversation last time.
Yeah, yeah. Phil, they're all different. Phil had to go. He was fine. Okay, let's reassemble here.
Tom, you were sharing a mic. You sure this is a good idea? I've got the mic by yourself.
We can separate it if you want. Mike, you're not going to run the video again. Not going to run the video.
I'm sorry, I do. Oh, thank you very much. But you're totally not.
Okay.
You should sit down, please.
Welcome back to our conversation marking the second year of the war in Ukraine. We've just finished a terrific conversation about whether it was an inflection point when Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. And we're now going to focus on questions of leadership and the difference leadership has made in this conflict, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not necessarily in that order. We're going to be looking at Vladimir Putin, President Biden, and Volodymyr Zelensky, but also at other leaders around the world and how they have seized on this as an opportunity or walked away from this as an opportunity to lead in the international system as well as at home. Together, how have these leaders defined the trajectory of the war, and how have they thought about politics within their own countries, as well as the world order? Conclusions about presidential leadership and decision-making in the 21st century are really important. They set a standard that other countries pay attention to and will have big implications, particularly as elections happen in the United States and in Russia later this year. For this panel, our special guest is Tom Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Tom was senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff in the Bush 43 administration, during which he managed the White House-Kremlin strategic dialogue. He was a career Foreign Service officer for 14 years, including 2 tours of duty at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And he's also served at the State Department policy planning staff. It's becoming a recurring theme, and on the staff of the Defense Department's Undersecretary for Policy. Tom's immediate respondents will be 2 distinguished UVA and Miller Center faculty members who I will introduce more fully in a bit, Alan Stam and Mark Silverstone. And then once again, I will introduce our other panelists as we go through the conversation, and we'll take questions from the audience. For those here in person, please again use the cards at your seats. For those online, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So, Tom, let's get started. Your recent book, Getting Russia Right, is a tour de force. You make a number of arguments about how the West has sized up Russia, including how we've gotten Russia wrong, going back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the return to great power competition. You argue that we did get Russia wrong in a number of key regards, but beyond that, you also say that we got Putin wrong and that Putin himself has made a number of mistakes. You give a very compelling analysis of the broad institutions and norms within which Putin operates in Russia, and we'll want you to talk about that, and then you discuss how he calculated and miscalculated in his invasion of Ukraine. So help us understand, is this a war we invited Russia to begin? Is this Putin's war? Is it Russia's war? And what did Putin's leadership style contribute to the conflict? Good, bad, and ugly.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. And it is a real pleasure to be here with this distinguished audience. And it's particularly good to be here with Eric Edelman, who's going to correct everything that I have to say about Russia in the next few minutes. Let me start with a fundamental point, and that is that it is almost impossible to exaggerate the role that Ukraine plays in the Russian imagination. It is the origins of its statehood, the cradle of its civilization. It's been an important buffer zone throughout history, an important source of Russian military power in both the late Tsarist period, clearly into the Soviet period as well. Any Russian leader would have been concerned about what was happening in Ukraine over the past several years, particularly this clear movement of Ukraine away from Russia's orbit into the Euro-Atlantic community. But not every Russian leader would have chosen to go to war to stop that, and Putin did. And I think there are at least three personal attributes that help us understand that decision. First is plain hubris. Putin had very little respect for Western leaders in February of 2024. That included President Biden. They looked at the chaotic exit from Afghanistan and made certain conclusions about what the United States would do in response to any military action by Russia. They had less respect for other Western leaders in Europe and almost no respect for the Ukrainian leadership at that point, particularly Volodymyr Zelensky, whose popularity was probably in the low 20s at that time. Second was that I think we've seen over the past several years a shift in the way Putin himself analyzes foreign policy. If you looked at his very initial years in power, he was very pragmatic. He would calculate balances of power, didn't run undue risks. Over the past 5 years, something that was exacerbated by his extreme isolation during the pandemic, is you've seen the growth of a messianic element in his thinking. He compares himself to Peter the Great, other great Russian czars. And what did great Russian czars do? They all expanded the empire. They gathered Russian lands together, and there was no part of Russia and the Russian inheritance that was more important than Ukraine from that standpoint. You've also seen Putin in more recently pose as this great leader of a anti-Western, anti-colonial movement. If we think of the conflict in terms of democracy versus autocracy, for Putin and Russian, right, it's the West versus the non-West, the world majority, and Putin sees himself as a major player in both bringing that world majority together and leading it. And then the final element that is important here on the personal side is that by moving into Ukraine, bringing it back into the Russian orbit, Putin had a chance to erase the blemishes on his own record in Ukraine. Remember back in 2004, he supported a presidential candidate who ended up on the losing side during the Orange Revolution. Even in 2014, I think Putin was undone in his own mind by the failure of the then Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, to be able to master this Maidan revolution. Putin wound up seizing Crimea at that point, but that was less than what he had wanted, which was to use Yanukovych as a lever to, in a sense, control the geopolitics of Ukraine as a whole. So those three things, hubris, messianism, and erasing the blemishes, I think played a large role in his decision to invade. Second is that what we have seen over the past several years is a radical narrowing of the circle of advisors around Putin, again, exacerbated by the extreme isolation during the pandemic. And those 3 or 4 people that he relied on, that he saw on a regular basis, in many ways were more antagonistic towards the West than Putin himself was. We can think of the Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, for example. There was a businessman who was also a major proponent of this great Russia and moving things forward. As I already said, most of the other key people you thought would have been engaged in the decision-making process in Russia were left on the sidelines and in the dark. Foreign ministry in particular. Foreign Minister Lavrov was aware that Russia was going to move militarily into Ukraine about 2 hours before it happened. Other people were simply left out of the loop. Then finally, I think what we've also seen over the past probably decade or more is a lessening of the restraints that other elite actors placed on Putin's ability to make decisions in isolation. This growing sense among much of the elites that without Putin, the system becomes destabilized, their position comes under threat, and therefore they're not willing to push against decisions that are already made as forcefully as they might have earlier in Putin's reign. And so all of those things led or gave Putin himself great latitude to make the decision on his own, and I said his own personal attributes made him quite confident that this was going to be a short, victorious war, and would have enhanced his position as a Russian leader. Now, because he thought it was going to be a short, victorious war, he did nothing to prepare the population as a whole, nor the elites, for this invasion. And that leads to the sort of the second large point that I want to make. And one of the things that Putin is concerned about, I think weighs heavily in his thinking, is popular reaction, popular support. It is, I think, important that from the very beginning, the Kremlin has refused to call this a war. It's a special military operation, which requires, or should require, very little input from the population as a whole. If you look at the way they went about the mobilization in the fall of 2022, it was a partial mobilization. They didn't want a full-scale mobilization because they thought that that would have a very large negative impact on the population as a whole. When they did mobilize, what they did was go after soldiers from the Far East, from the minority republics, those populations that were less likely to protest against conscription, and they basically left alone Moscow, St. Petersburg, the big cities, where they wanted a more tranquil environment. And because popular unrest in Moscow and St. Petersburg carries political consequences that go far beyond what happens in the rest of the country. When it comes to Moscow, what you saw the Kremlin do is crack down very hard on the initial demonstrations against the conflict, to make it clear that this would not be tolerated, and that the Kremlin has gradually over time put in place ever more repressive legislation, have cracked down even harder. They are deeply concerned about the sort of liberal professional class being seen in active protest, and then linking up in some way with some of the other sort of socioeconomic dissatisfaction you see in the country. That is what I think the Kremlin sees as a significant threat to its own position. This is the way the Soviet Union came undone in the late 1980s. This is the way the revolution was launched back in 1917. So very much a focus now on keeping the population, the politically active population, as far removed from the conflict as possible. You go to Moscow today, you see very few signs of war at all. Restaurants are filled, people are out on the streets enjoying themselves. Finally, a couple of other points that you asked me to address. First, on the effectiveness. We saw clearly that this decision-making process was not effective in the initial phase of the conflict. Gross miscalculations, misread the Western unity, misread Ukrainian capabilities, over-exaggerated Russian military capabilities, overestimated the role that Russian energy and European energy dependence on Russia would have as this conflict unfolded. So you saw the gross miscalculation. I think some nervousness in the Kremlin through 2022, particularly in the fall, with successful Ukrainian counteroffensives around Kherson and Kharkiv. But if you look at what has happened over the past several months, actually a great deal of resilience in this system that has led to, I think, confidence at this point in Russian capabilities. We will get a sense of how firmly Putin is in control in the next several weeks, the Russian presidential election. We all know that Putin is going to win. That's not the issue. The question is how he wins, and there will be targets on turnout, targets on percentage of votes that the elite has to deliver, and they need to deliver that with a minimum of blatant fraud. If he can do that, then Putin will have demonstrated his continuing mastery of the political system, and that will filter down through the elites to population as a whole. It will validate what he's been doing in the conflict so far. If, on the other hand, you don't meet those marks where it has to be done with blatant fraud, that sends a signal of political weakness that some people will be able to exploit. Final point, and I'll stop here. If you think of a next leader, we don't know when that's going to happen, but it will eventually. Given sort of the difficulties of consolidating power, given the other sort of domestic and international challenges you face, I don't expect that we're going to get a leader that's more aggressive than Putin at this point. I think you will get a leader who returns to this more traditional way, Russian way of pursuing foreign policy, which is pragmatic, realpolitik, clear calculation, a balance of power, and this will open up an opportunity for, I think, some geopolitical reordering in the priorities that Russia sets for its foreign policy going forward.
Tom, that's really terrific. I'm going to ask one quick follow-up, and then I'll turn to Alan and Mark here. You talked a little bit about President Putin's assessment of Zelensky, that his popularity was not particularly high at the outset of the war. Talk a little bit, if you will, about his assessment of both Biden and Xi. There was a lot of talk that the way the U.S. government handled, for instance, the pullout of Afghanistan might have sent a signal to Putin that Biden was weak and didn't want to pay attention to international affairs. Right before the invasion, they talked about their partnership without limits with President Xi. We've seen some limits in that partnership, and we've seen a fairly robust response from President Biden, even if he's not been able to, as of yet, secure the next round of support for Ukraine. Give us a little bit of a sense of how much Putin is watching these other leaders and assessing them.
Well, he watches the other leaders very, very closely. That's what presidents of Russia do. There was a strange assessment of Biden at that point in September and the fall of 2022. On the one hand, they did see that weakness, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. But they also saw something that they thought would be helpful to them, and that was strength, in the sense that Biden went through with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, despite this considerable resistance within the American political establishment, within his own administration, to going down that path as rapidly as he did. And what they concluded from that was that Biden himself would see the impossibility of putting up significant resistance to Russia, moving into Ukraine, and even if there were significant pressure inside the United States to push back against Russia, Biden would demonstrate that strong presidential leadership and not take that action. So I think they misread the president clearly. They misread the American, may not have misread where the American political elite was, but they misread Putin, and that encouraged the move into Ukraine in February. With Xi, look, there's been a close personal bond between these two men that has developed over the past decade. This is the person that the national leader that Putin feels closest to. We don't know exactly what was said in that meeting in February, a few weeks before the invasion, the No Limits partnership. I suspect that Putin wasn't fully open with Xi as to what his intentions were. All that said, the relationship with Xi remains strong, and we've seen that over the past couple of meetings between the two men. That said, my sense is that while Russia is drawing closer to China as a consequence of this collapse of relationship with the West, that the Russians and Putin himself are not fully satisfied with the support that they're getting from China. This isn't like Iran, North Korea, that are providing lethal weapon that is on the battlefield. I think there's a sense in the Kremlin that clearly China does not want Russia to be defeated, and they will provide the type of support that's necessary to prevent that. On the other hand, they're not convinced that China wants Russia to win. And they're not persuaded that China is doing as much as it could to provide investment into the Russian economy that will help it grow over the long run, and not merely take advantage of Russia's straitened circumstances now to get access to natural resources that knock down prices, and to put products into the Russian market where they've been abandoned by the West, cars and smartphones being prime examples.
That's really great. Thank you, Tom. I'm going to turn to Alan Stamm. Alan is University Professor of Public Policy and Politics here at UVA. He's also a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow. He's the former Dean of the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and is himself an expert on leadership. He has, of his many books, The Behavioral Origins of War and Why Leaders Fight. So Alan, as you've studied leaders and leadership, as you've taught it and designed curriculum around it, as you've been a leader, your research tells us that leaders' choices are shaped by a myriad of factors. So what are the factors that you're looking at? What are the motivations? What are the constraints? Who do they lead? How do they lead? And what have you learned 2 years into this conflict about the key leaders involved?
Wow, it's a pretty high bar. Thanks
Lead
for
us,
that
please.
saucy introduction, Bill. So I'm a political scientist. I'm not a historian, so I don't specialize in a particular country or place, which can be, I tend to think in generalities rather than detailed specifics. And in that way, when we think about leaders and leadership, we sort of think about it in three layers. One would be the one that Mr. Graham has talked about, the personal history and the personal character and attributes of the leader. In that regard, a couple of things in our data analysis of broad data sets of leaders, leader age is something that comes out, and how that interacts in the institutional setting in which they work. Older leaders typically, but not always, tend to be much more experienced. So in the type of decision-making that's taking place with regard to very high-stakes events like this war in Ukraine. Experience is something that is, I think, underappreciated by people reading the newspaper, the general public. And so both President Biden and President Putin, at this point, for better or for worse, regardless of one's opinion of their choices, they're very experienced. They've been managing at the highest levels of executive power literally for decades. And, you know, we see this in the U.S. presidential setting, that foreign policy decisions made by presidents in their second terms tend to be somewhat qualitatively better than those in their first. The second thing that we look at generally, and that there's an enormous literature and political science on, is the group setting, the small group crisis management setting that these leaders make their decisions in or with the advice of. And one of the critical aspects of those group dynamics is, are they homogeneous in the sense that, you know, the popular characterization would be they're surrounded by yes men. And so in President Putin's case, there's generally a sense that and others will be able to comment better than I, but that he looks for a particular type of person to provide him advice, and it's not somebody that's telling him he's making a huge mistake. In the American setting, clearly President Biden is hearing it from literally all directions, both from within his own advisory group. So, for example, in the State Department with regard to Gaza a couple of weeks ago, there was a letter signed by anonymous staffers deeply criticizing the president's decision. So in the U.S. case here, there's information coming from all different avenues, which can be extraordinarily challenging for the individual having to process this information. It can be difficult, to be incredibly stressful, but at the same time, it tends to help them avoid making blind alleys. The third aspect of the group, though, is the deference to this individual leader. And again, President Putin, there's definitely a sense, at least from the things that we learned at the outset of the war, that he tends to be given more deference than I think we're seeing President Biden receive. I'll get to President Zelensky in just a moment. It's the third aspect. It's the broader institutional setting in which these presidents work that shapes the options that they have, importantly, particularly at the outset of these conflicts, but also the president's expectations of how they're going to be treated after the conflict's over. And so we, as political scientists, we tend to sort of lump things together for categorization purposes, and we think of democracies, oligarchies, and authoritarian or dictatorships. Now, in democratic systems, if a democratic president makes a terrible mistake, essentially the worst punishment they're going to face is being voted out of office. President Biden will have a multi-million-dollar book deal. He'll be able to retire to his beach house in Delaware. Worse things have happened to human beings. One of the things about dictators is that they tend to have consolidated power extraordinarily, and so they're able to also ride out, in different ways, but terrible mistakes. It's the group in the middle, the oligarchs, that oftentimes face brutal punishment for bad mistakes, and particularly for leading their countries into wars whose outcomes, and Mr. Graham addressed this, where the general public views the outcome of the war as a mistake, as a bad outcome, as a failure. In those settings, oligarchic leaders are treated oftentimes either by exile, death, or completely being ostracized by their sort of body politic. Now, from a sort of intellectual academic perspective, what makes this particular situation so interesting is that Russia today is evolving from an oligarchy into a personalist dictatorship. The United States, I may be speaking, disagree with some of my colleagues, but I think that we're still a fairly stable democracy, current events notwithstanding. Ukraine is transitioning from an oligarchy to a democracy. What we don't know is I hope some of my colleagues can illuminate this, what would be essentially the post-war treatment that President Putin and President Zelensky might reasonably expect or believe to be facing as they contemplate if there are any negotiated settlements that might be acceptable to them personally, given their personal attributes and the advice that they're getting from their inner circle of advisors. And so, the good news is I think we have a really useful set of tools to help think through the detailed information that our historical colleagues can focus on. The challenge is that many of the things that if we look back in history as canonical examples, the features of those important examples that determined the outcome, the change in leadership, intervention by a third party, those are up in the air, and the domestic political attributes and institutional features are uncertain at the moment, in the sense that they appear to be changing. With regard, and I'll stop here, President Zelensky's inner circle, for example, appeared to, at the beginning of the war, provide him with actually fairly unbiased information. He is taking steps, it appears, in the last week, to make his inner circle more in line with his own personal view of thinking, which increases his comfort level in making decisions, at the same time may reduce the quality of the information that he's presented with. And so I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Bill.
Great, thanks, Alan. A lot to get into there, and I know we're going to want to follow up. But finally, I'll bring in Mark Silverstone before we open it up to the conversation. Mark is the Director of Presidential Studies here. He has for many, many years been the co-director of the Center's Presidential Recordings Program, listening to the secret Oval Office tapes of the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and a few other presidents before and since then administration. He's a historian of the Cold War with one book on how the U.S. and Great Britain responded to the rise of communism, and another book on the Kennedy administration's fraught decisions on whether to withdraw or stay in Vietnam before President Kennedy's assassination. Mark has also studied extensively the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both of which have echoes in the current conflict, as well as America's two-decade engagement in Afghanistan. So Mark, as you look across all of those big trajectories in the Cold War and a lot of the proxy wars that have defined the relationship between the United States and Russia, the United States and China, what are you seeing in the current moment, particularly in the Biden administration, but also in these other leaders, particularly since politics have changed in Russia and in China over that period of time, but there is a lot of consistency about the kinds of conflicts that we've seen.
Yeah. So I'll say at the outset that I took note during the previous panel of all the times that various people said that they were wrong, and I took some comfort in that as I begin my remarks, especially with members of various administrations in attendance. Administrations I'll be talking about, but this issue of the trajectory of presidential leadership as we saw it in the Cold War. In the post-war era, more generally in the post-Cold War period, is fascinating to take a look at in the context of what's happening now in Ukraine, but also to take a look at the trajectory within an administration and how that evolves and what happens from the first year to the second to the third, and in particular, as we have spoken about, this dynamic that we've seen from time to time in which there's an early stumble, a first year, could be early in the first year, could be later in the first year, but then oftentimes a rebound with the administration achieving some measure of success later on. And there's a question of what happens between point A and point B. Did something really take place on the front end in terms of an after-action report, a post-mortem that was done that gave the administration an opportunity to learn from its mistakes and then succeed? And so that's essentially what I'm going to focus on here. In the Biden case, of course, the stumble was clear for all to see. August of 2021, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The leading narrative that came out of that episode was that this withdrawal hurt both Biden and the country's credibility, as well as its reputation abroad. We've spoken a little bit about that in this panel, as well as the previous one. That was certainly the case with the execution of withdrawal. The sense of competence, ironically, that Joe Biden had campaigned on in 2020 was not in great evidence during those days and weeks at the end of August of 21. But even the fact of withdrawal, I would say, was still a matter of debate for so many, as there were calls for him to revisit the Doha Agreement signed by President Trump in February of 2020, and not just some of its particulars regarding what the Taliban would or would not do, but really the very fact of a United States withdrawal, that it would be possible for the United States to keep any number of advisors there, to make sure that there was still some stability in the country to protect American interests, even recognizing that the reason for going in the first place, the removal of al-Qaeda, had been achieved. I think it's unlikely that Biden would have revisited, given everything that he had said about it for years and years, but there was certainly a narrative out there that he should have done that. Ultimately, what it seems to have done is spooked America's allies and emboldened America's adversaries. At least that's the narrative that came out of that episode. And ultimately, it smoothed the path for Vladimir Putin to wage war on Ukraine. But then, lo and behold, once the war began, 6 months later, after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we see the reemergence of Biden the competent. I wonder if you could even term him that. Observers certainly criticized the reluctance of the Biden team to speed up the delivery of weapons systems to Ukraine, particularly increasingly sophisticated weapons systems that might have helped them early on in the conflict and certainly later in the conflict, and perhaps even have led to a different situation on the ground than it is today. But be that as it may, he still seemed to show real leadership in terms of his strategic declassification of intelligence, his ability to mobilize an international response, his ability to continue to hold an alliance together, the imposition of economic sanctions, the provision of lethal aid, economic aid, really an extraordinary performance for many, again, in the wake of Afghanistan. So, where else have we seen these dynamics? A stumble followed by a success. Is there something that those other episodes can teach us about presidential leadership, and perhaps even about the role of credibility and resolve in the way that leaders, as well as their adversaries, think about them? There are lots of cases we can look at. I chose two. Both involve policies actually held over from a prior administration, which is the case that we see here in Afghanistan. One involves President Clinton, and the various stumbles that his administration had in 1993, 1994, beginning with Somalia, in which a UN humanitarian mission turned into a peacekeeping mission, turned into a military mission to capture the warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. We know what happened later with the Black Hawk Down episode and the death of 18 American soldiers, scores further wounded. It was a real black eye for the administration. It certainly challenged the sense of competence that it had when the U.S. took out its forces roughly 6 months later. It also raised questions about American resolve and its willingness to stay with a fight and its credibility. This was followed October of 1993, roughly a week or so later, by the episode in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, when the USS Harlan County went in trying to offload a couple hundred U.S. troops to help restore a democratically elected president to power. Armed mobs showed up on the docks there, chanting Somalia, Somalia, and the Harlan County turned around. Things would be better months later through the intervention of President Carter and working with President Clinton on this. But essentially, it was another relatively quick black eye for the administration that once again called into question its competence in foreign policy. 8 months later, the Rwandan genocide, spring, summer of 1994. Lots of blame to go all around, to be sure, between the UN and the United States, but all were pretty slow to react, with the Clinton administration famously reluctant to use the term genocide. It's admitting that acts of genocide had happened, but that didn't go over terribly well. Once again, America's reputation, Clinton's reputation, took a hit for its failure to stand up for key principles. And there was a double standard that people perceived at work, that perhaps African lives were less precious than European lives. And that was a particularly live matter because all through this time, there were concerns about what was happening in the Balkans. And by then, in particular, what was happening in Bosnia. where the administration, first under George H.W. Bush, but then really under President Clinton, were trying to protect these enclaves of Bosnian Muslims from the predations of the Bosnian Serbs. Again, all of this emanating from the breakup of Yugoslavia and Bosnia-Herzegovina's declaration of independence in February of 1992. The international community was largely ineffective through all these years. The turnaround seems to have happened really just from the pressure of events, I would say, and here's where I want to be corrected by those who served in that administration, with an inflection point coming in July of '95 and the genocide really in Srebrenica and the killing of 7,000 Muslim men and boys. It seems to have created the need for a much more focused and purposeful response than the administration had mounted up to that time. There was also this sense that the credibility of the United States and NATO were tanking. They could no longer muddle through this crisis. And so the president himself became much more directly involved, calling for an integrated strategy that married diplomacy as well as force. Tony Lake, the national security advisor, also becomes much more involved, shifting, I would say, from a position of an honest broker to that of a policy advocate. And as a result, and not just after Srebrenica, but the bombing of the market in Sarajevo a month or so later, we get NATO airstrikes on Serb positions in August of '95, followed by the Dayton Accords in November of that year. So a real success, but finally after years of struggle. In looking at these two cases, the Clinton cases as well as Biden, and maybe any parallels between them, it is notable that both of their rebounds came in the European theater. And I don't know how much we want to make of that, or the notion that had been bandied about, certainly at the time, that perhaps there were some unspoken racial considerations involved about, again, how precious were the lives of Europeans as opposed to non-Europeans. But there were certainly strategic considerations involved, given that Europe was the primary focus and really engine of the major wars of the 20th century and of the Cold War. The Cold War originates in the center of Europe. The question of the disposition of Germany is really at the heart of it. So the European context and the implications thereof really galvanized both administrations. That's not the case when you get back to the Kennedy administration, for whom the most important, as he said, the most dangerous area of the world really was the Caribbean. And it's in 1961, April of that year, when he faces his early stumble at the Bay of Pigs. He will have lots of other travails during the year as well, but the postmortem that's done on that, I think in some ways is more consequential for his administration than the postmortems, to the extent that they took place for both Biden and Clinton, given their policy stumbles. I think the consequences were more overt. You see greater changes in personnel. The top folks at the CIA are cashiered within a relatively short period of time. The number two at the State Department is also sent packing. He becomes a roving international advisor. But Kennedy essentially sends those folks who were deemed either disloyal or not really team players away, and certainly those that gave him, as he felt, bad advice. And in come folks who he can trust a little bit more. Brother Bobby, who's the Attorney General, who's going to play a larger role in foreign policy. Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter. The process also becomes much more rigorous. Again, folks who've been in more recent administrations can weigh in on whether the process changes as qualitatively more recently. But it certainly seemed to change with the Kennedy administration. He becomes much more buttoned down. The paper flow is more regular. They establish a White House Situation Room to improve the level of communications coming in as well as going out, all of which leaves him better positioned for what happens in October of 1962. There are issues of credibility involved throughout. It certainly weighs on Khrushchev's mind in thinking about whether he can get away with deploying offensive capabilities in the Caribbean. He doubts that Kennedy is really up to this after Kennedy's fecklessness as he saw it in the Bay of Pigs, his willingness to accept the construction of the Berlin Wall in August of 1961. So there's this sense that, that he's empowered by Kennedy's actions. I don't want to go on too much longer. I've said probably enough, but just to sum up, it's not as clear to me that Biden's early stumbles conditioned his and Putin's actions in Ukraine as much as we saw in the Clinton case, and Kennedy's even more so as regards to Cuba. And it may not even be the case that the perception of Biden's credibility deficit contributed to Putin's invasion. There's been competing approaches on this account, recognizing that issues of credibility are often context-specific, whereas matters of resolve usually speak to individuals' stances on more substantive and long-going concerns, one's willingness to stand up for principles, one's willingness to stick with a commitment, for let's say. But with respect to Biden's credibility on Afghanistan and its impact on Ukraine, one can point to a variety of moments where the Biden administration telegraphed precisely what it was prepared to do on Ukraine and followed through, both in terms of its provision of lethal assistance as well as sanctions. And I took note of what Alex had to say previously regarding the connection between the two, and would be interested in pursuing that further as well.
So I'm keen to bring in Eric Edelman here, Eric, particularly because as we've all been meeting in the war room and talking about this for 2 years, while often giving enormous credit to the way the Biden administration has handled the war, you've largely been encouraging them to do more and not take themselves out of the fight on a number of things, not deter themselves. And yet in the last few months, we've been all watching the struggles the administration has had to get Republican support, even for what appears by that standard to be maybe not half a loaf, but 3/4 of a loaf. So I'm curious, particularly as Mark reflected on his
95% of a loaf.
There you go. As Mark reflected on some of this history, some of which we worked on together. I'm not talking about Cuba here, I'm talking about Bosnia. I'm just curious to get your take on, particularly in the lens of history, where Biden sits right now, having not gone as far as you'd like, but can't get farther than the Republican Congress will let him go.
Bill, I am not going to answer for the sins of a Republican Congress. Well, first of all, contrary to Tom, I did not find anything to correct in his presentation. I thought it was terrific and reminded me of the great reporting officer he was in Moscow when we served together on then Soviet internal politics. I am curious, and I would love to hear your thoughts about, with regard to your final comments about Putin's control being revealed in the election, with the apparent Central Electoral Commission's disqualification of Boris Nadezhdin, who is a candidate running against Putin, who nobody gave much chance of obviously beating Putin, but who did seem to generate a lot of enthusiasm because of his criticism of the special military operations. I'm curious about what you think is behind the disqualification, since obviously letting him run and still winning would, give at least some surface plausibility to, the election, as you were saying. On the question of credibility and deterrence, in the previous panel, Jim Steinberg, I don't know if Jim's still here, but Jim raised a question about whether the administration erred by, ab initio, saying we're not going to be directly involved in that, undercutting deterrence and coercion. And, Alex talked in his remarks about the failure to to see the potential of a long war, which, by the way, is not just unique to the Biden administration. This is a problem that Mara and I have been wrestling with, and in another context, in a project we're engaged in reviewing for Congress the National Defense Strategy, and you know, basically, you know, for a very long time, the Department of Defense has assumed that it will only be engaged in very short wars, and we're discovering that when you get into wars of great powers, the chance of it becoming a more protracted conflict is very, very great. I think overall, because we took a holiday from having to worry about nuclear deterrence for about 30 years, we have not thought very deeply about the problem of deterrence. And we have fallen into a trap, I think, that Americans very typically fall into, which is to try and understand what deters the adversary by figuring out what would deter us, which is a enormous mistake. I mean, this is a mistake that Henry Kissinger actually pointed out in one of his lesser-known books, not his big book on nuclear strategy, but a book he wrote a few years later called The Necessity of Choice, which he wrote in early 1961, when the nation was facing for the first time the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and we were going from a period during the era of massive retaliation when policymakers had the luxury of 6 or 7 or 8 hours of warning time in case there were a Soviet attack, to 30 minutes, which powerfully concentrated people's minds. And Kissinger's observation at the time was, when it comes to deterrence, you're operating essentially in an area of uncertainty, because what matters is not what you think deters, but what the adversary thinks will deter them. And you can never absolutely know that. You can try and approximate it, you can try to understand it. But in that context, as Kissinger said, a bluff that is perceived by the adversary as serious is actually a better deterrent than a serious step that the adversary thinks is a bluff. And my criticism of the Biden administration has been that it seems to have forgotten that lesson, and rather than seeing its task as creating doubt in the mind of the adversary, it has been advertising its own doubts, which gives the adversary a giant leg up in deterring us, in my view. And by constantly describing not the things that we might do, but the things that we wouldn't do, and by the way, then frequently going ahead and doing them anyway, I think they have damaged their ability to deter, and in some sense perhaps raise the stakes down the road when if this conflict takes a very nasty turn, if, for instance, the Congress doesn't pass the supplemental or some version of it, which, oh, by the way, will be spent largely in the United States, replenishing the stocks of military equipment that we've run down, that we, the United States, need, not just for Europe, but for other contingencies as well. End of rant.
Oops, the mic, sorry about that. I would like to go back both to Eric's comments, but I'm curious, Mark, I think, anticipated that I might have a slightly different take on some of what he laid out. But also Alan and Tom's points about what I want to kind of question and push folks on is the extent to which politics plays a huge role as opposed to kind of grand theory. And whether, frankly, and one of the things I learned from President Clinton was that politics is a big factor, whether you're an oligarch or an autocrat or care about elections. And you shouldn't, negate the fact. So it's not surprising to me, Tom, right, that Putin cares where popular opinion is. And that is a factor, maybe differently than we might anticipate, but it's a factor in his decision-making. And I would say for President Clinton, I was in the second term, but in the first term, I was in Congress working as the chief counsel for Lee Hamilton on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and having to deal with endless threats to cut off funding for various things that the president wanted to do. Lee Hamilton was the chairman, and then the second 2 years of President Clinton's first term, the House was run by Republicans who were definitely feeling their oats because it was the first time they had been in charge in the House in 50 years. I will also say, though, that when you talked about the difference with the Balkans, guess who was the biggest proponent and, frankly, a constant kind of thorn in President Clinton's side and a challenge for Lee Hamilton on Bosnia and how aggressively the administration should move? Joe Biden, who was then at Senate Foreign Relations Committee, felt very strongly about U.S. engagement in the Balkans, felt that the administration was being far too timid and holding back, and had Republicans with him. Bob Dole, right, who at that point, so Dole and Biden together, and pushed various legislation. So if you look at kind of what was pushing the administration on the Balkans, it was kind of the outside context, and they had exactly the opposite problem. Their withdrawal from Somalia, they were going to lose all money. And we were trying to just hold on to streams in the House that would give the president the ability to be president. And so I would also just put that down as context for folks who are big proponents of that change should be in Congress and that Congress needs to have greater war powers authority. Congress constantly pushes presidents by controlling the purse on the decisions they make or don't make at various times. And so I think any analysis of kind of the trajectory of what leaders decide at given points should be grappling with the politics of what they're dealing with, but also with them finding their own footing. So I think part of the first term, second term, particularly when you have presidents who haven't worked internationally, is for them to recognize, and I saw it happen with President Clinton, I think President Biden has this more intuitively, that international politics and domestic politics are actually the same dynamic. You got to know how to read people and situations and understand what your adversary's challenges are politically, and be able to surround yourself frankly, rather than yes men or no, but with folks who get it on the politics. And those are the people you're going to listen to more. So I would argue that part of what happened for President Clinton, even in his first term, is he started listening to Sandy Berger more, who was the deputy, and to Tony a little less. And I think you see some of those dynamics play out in various administrations as presidents find their own footing on trying to do the stuff. So that's, I saw a thread of what you all put out, but I just wanted to pull that thread a little bit more for this.
Alex.
Thanks. I mean, this has really been a fascinating conversation and a great opportunity for me to kind of put into a historical context some of the questions that I've been wrestling with. I want to make two quick points. The first one is on Afghanistan. I think, and its relationship, in other words, to President Putin's decision-making. It's an open question why President Putin decided to invade. Ultimately, it's impossible to get into his mind and to resolve that. But I think it's important to have the timeline in front of us as we assess that. And I say that because Russia deployed tens of thousands of troops along the Ukrainian border in April, before any decision had been made about what to do in Afghanistan. Putin published his long historical essay arguing essentially that Ukraine had no independent existence, either in June or July. I don't recall which one. And if Chairman Milley is to be believed, the plans for the invasion were developed before August. So the ultimate decision may have been impacted in one way or another by a sense of resolve or credibility. But the idea of what President Putin wanted to do was in motion almost a year before. And I think that's a really important context for it. The second point, and this is sort of banal, but I think worth raising, is you defined elements of thinking about leadership, but there's another school of international relations which argues essentially leadership's actually not that important, that we should be looking at structural factors, at states as unified actors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think many people have said this, but those in government tend to reject that IR perspective and see personality as extraordinarily important and usually determinative of decision making, whereas in the academy it's sort of the other way around. And I think what's so rich about this case is this is a case where leadership clearly matters a lot. It matters, as Tom Graham has argued, Putin made decisions that another Russian leader might not have, for a whole host of reasons. And you didn't even mention his confidence in secrets, which may have led him to believe that he could pull this off without anyone knowing, which ended up being wrong. We've talked a little bit about Joe Biden. his long history of experience, his relationship with NATO leaders, his relationship and experience dealing with Putin in the first place, his upbringing in the Cold War, the way that he framed Ukraine's struggle as a struggle for democracy against authoritarianism is a Joe Biden perspective, and would not have been shared necessarily by another Democratic president, to say nothing of a potential Republican president in our next election. And then you have to add in Zelensky, because in some ways he makes the argument better than the other two do. Here's a guy who was an entertainer, totally underestimated, not only by Putin, but by some in the American administration, as somebody essentially who could make people laugh, but didn't have really the interior composition to lead. And he's flipped that script entirely, taking the skills of an entertainer and turning them into leadership and communicating with the Ukrainian people in a way that a different kind of politician might not have been able to do. And you just think about him appearing 2 or 3 days ago on the front lines in a bunker under Russian assault, and there's a degree of bravery or risk acceptance there that is highly unusual. So anyway, I say this because as we assess, kind of analytically think about what's happening, I think this is an argument for leadership mattering. But it's also, as we assess leadership in our own country going forward, that decision will be an extremely weighty one for this whole problem.
I'm curious, as a question to the whole table, about the issue of fatigue. Tom and Alan, to some degree, everybody here has talked about not just the leaders themselves, but the people immediately around them. This has been going on for 2 years. Those of us that know Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, particularly Tony, Bill Burns, the age, 2 years have been like dog years, 14 years for them. It's been an incredibly wearying time. That must be the case in Russia. That's certainly the case in Ukraine. Maybe Yuri can tell us a little bit about that. We're seeing Zelensky now re-examining his leadership group. In China, we've seen some actually pretty extraordinary turnover in the last 2 or 3 years. It gets mentioned as a blip on the screen and then it goes away. And I'm just wondering, as several people have noticed, this has gone on much longer than was anticipated. What happens to those teams as 2 years pass, 3 years pass, 4 years pass? What can we expect to happen in these leadership teams?
Alan may take issue with what I'm about to say, but I think, academic social science in the realm of international relations has not proven a lot of non-trivial propositions, but I think it's proven one conclusively: tired people make bad decisions. And I think all of us who've been in government have seen that up close and personal. One of the things I do worry about is the degree to which, at least, I don't worry so much about President Putin's, sleep habits, but I do worry about, whether the Biden team is running themselves ragged a little bit, and whether that will begin to really tell in this next year when they're in the midst of a presidential election, which is always a very difficult year for any administration.
Can I?
Yeah, Tom?
Just very quickly on this. I think we need to remember that most of Putin's close cohorts are old men. Putin himself is 71. Everybody around him that's engaged in this, well, he should be dead by Russian standards.
Average life expectancy is 57.
His late 60s, most in the early 70s. Some of them are in poor health. And they weren't expecting a long conflict at all. Now, they have taken the steps to prepare for a longer conflict. Now, they've put their economy on a war footing. They're looking at maybe 2 or 3 years into the future. Nevertheless, again, old men, tired, make poor decisions. The question to well they actually understand the objective circumstances in which they're operating is, I think, is a big issue going forward.
Yeah, so I just had just a thought by this, and not so much about the political leaders themselves, but the military organizations that they're running. And so there's actually, again, a big literature on this that's not trivial, that looks at essentially military organizations' combat effectiveness increases actually quite dramatically over the first 90 to 180 days of combat, and then begins to just deteriorate monotonically afterwards. Now, in long wars, so if we look at World War I, 2 adaptations took place, which is a big, long European war. On the European side, they switched to a full mobilization policy where every year there would be a new cohort of young men that were being brought in that did not have the deleterious effects of having 180 days of combat. And then the United States arrived in late 1917, early 1918, that was fresh, and simply changed the tempo on the battlefield that the Germans weren't able to match in any way. What's different that's going on right now is neither Ukraine nor Russia have made this transition to an attrition-based annual mobilization process. And so the forces on both sides of the forward edge of the battle area, the front line, at this point are incredibly ground down, both in terms of their numbers, but probably more importantly, in terms of their just emotional and physical capacities. And so that it seems very unlikely that we will see the pace of operations we saw in the first 6 months of the first year. So the impact of this is on leaders trying to think through what are the options we have available for an offensive breakout, for example. That type of operation requires extraordinary physical and emotional capacity to sustain for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. And right now, neither side has made the military transformations that would require us to be able to see that in the coming spring.
Yuri, I want to bring in Yuri Urbanovich, who teaches in the politics department here and taught in the Russian School of Diplomacy. Yuri, you've been following not just Putin, but Zelensky, and particularly the domestic challenges that he's faced. I wonder if you could give us some thoughts about where this might go. And just for the group, we have about 8 minutes left for this session. So if you give us a few, and then we can try to come back and wrap things up.
Thank you, Bill. I actually prepared a long presentation, which I will publish.
We will be happy to publish. Give us some headlines.
Yeah, okay. Specifically speaking about Zelensky, when Zelensky came to power, he was a lovable person, a former comedian, and I watched all of his, productions. He was, really very, talented actor, very talented comedian, and very popular, not only in Ukraine, but in Russia as well. He was and he made a lot of money in Russia, by the way, performing, there. But, situation, had changed, unfortunately for him. A few words about Ukraine itself. Ukraine is a very beautiful country, beautiful people, absolutely fascinating climate. In certain areas like in California, okay, people have beautiful voices, among of them are great singers, actors, writers, film directors, and so forth. When Catherine the Great, took territory, which is located on the Black Sea from the Ottoman Empire, at that time it was all the Russian Empire, she encouraged people from Eastern Europe particularly to move, to what became known as New Russia, Novorossiya, okay? Many of them came from Greece, from Bulgaria, from Romania, from Hungary, from Poland, Ukrainians, many Jewish people as well, especially in Odessa. So if you look at the list of our outstanding film directors, at the Hollywood, many of them have, by the way, Odessian roots.
Eric Edelman's own ancestors.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I tell you, even Sylvester Stallone's babushka, or grandmother, Madame Rosenblum, she was originally from Odessa, So my point is that, many talented people, traditionally lived on the territory of this beautiful country. And one of them was Zelensky. Zelensky was from very distinguished Jewish family. His, father was a professor. His grandfather was, highly decorated, I would say, officer of the Red Army, who fought during World War II against the Nazis. And he ended up his career as a colonel. But of course, dealing with all these challenges was not easy for him, and everybody was impressed that he managed, I would say, to demonstrate, his resilience, his bravery, and his ability, to lead the country, being absolutely inexperienced in this sense. Now, on a practical note, let me emphasize what are his challenges, as of now. In December, polls, demonstrated, I have this information from Ukraine. In December, it was found that while 62% of Ukrainians said they trusted Zelensky, 88% said they trusted Zaluzhny, commander of, armed forces.
Soon to be former commander of armed forces.
Now former. Moreover, I tell you, as far as I know, Zelensky made a decision to appoint him ambassador of Ukraine to London. And I don't know to what extent this is trustworthy information, but nevertheless, I think it was a wise decision because, he is a real, I would say, challenge to Zelensky. And if they would have presidential elections, it looks like that Zaluzhny has more chances to win. So if, by the way, Gorbachev were, more, I would say, experienced politically, he could have appointed Yeltsin, somewhere in Ouagadougou, after he was fired, and thus, to survive. But he, so to say, allowed to stay his political opponent in Moscow, and as a result, he got into trouble, So Zelensky, let me quote, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on February the 5th submitted to his country's parliament draft laws to extend martial law and the military mobilization in the country as Russia's full-scale invasion nears the 2-year mark. Now, Zelensky's drafts provide the extension of the two measures for another 90 days from February 14th, in line with the provisions of Ukrainian constitution. This will be the 10th time since February 24th, 2022, that the Verkhovna Rada will vote on two measures. In November, Zelensky strongly hinted at a potential delay of the presidential polls, saying it would be irresponsible to hold it under wartime conditions. The two drafts were sent to lawmakers a day after Zelensky confirmed in an interview with Italian broadcaster that he is considering operating changes among Ukraine's military and political leadership amid widespread speculation that he is about to dismiss General Valery Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine military. Conclusion. As it is known, on March 31st is a deadline for scheduling presidential elections in Ukraine. Of course, it raises question after that about the legitimacy of the president to execute his responsibilities after the deadline. It is a challenge to his legitimacy, unfortunately. So we'll see, how it will work, but so far it's a very challenging, two questions. On one hand, martial law, On the other hand, new law on mobilization of Ukrainian men, particularly.
Yuri, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to bring it back to our three lead speakers for a minute of closing thoughts each. We're approaching 6:15, so maybe go in reverse order and give Tom the last word here. As we think about leadership in the coming year, Mark, what are you looking for?
I'd like to see, stepping out of my historian's role, I'd like to see President Biden be more assertive in speaking to the country, so that rhetorically he can match the presumed commitment that he has made to the defense of Ukraine with an understanding of what is needed from our own country. It's remarkable that he has spoken directly to this country, in this country, only twice, really. Once from the East Room, just as the invasion began, but then also in October. And in that case, it was as much about Israel as it was about Ukraine. He has certainly addressed various audiences, whether it's at a NATO summit, whether it's in Warsaw or Vilnius, but his presence has been noticeably lacking, I would say.
It's a steady theme in the war room over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Alan?
I'm going to grab that drumstick with both hands. I think that President Biden, if there is one single thing I would point to as a tremendous flaw in his management of this war, and we've talked about the importance of the people, public perception, the support of the American people, the support of the Ukrainian people. It is extraordinary, in my own view, that President Biden has not made a dedicated national address to the American people to explain to them why this war in Ukraine and the U.S. support of the Ukrainians is so essential to American security, to security of Western Europe, to the security of all of our allies, that the entire system of Western security is built at its core around our credibility and reputation to supporting our allies and friends. And I hope that at some point in the coming year, if only being driven by the coming election in November, that he will finally make that statement.
So, Tom, this sets you up perfectly, given how much we've gotten Russia wrong. How does President Biden give that speech in a way that's not just compelling at home, but is compelling abroad, including to Russia? In 1 minute.
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that question. Of course, circumstances on the ground may change the context in which he has to deliver that address. I think one of the questions that we need to ask now is, under what circumstances would Putin change his view as to what his goals are, whether he continues with the military operation, or whether it's time to seek a negotiated settlement, thinking that he's gotten as much as he can and he needs to consolidate that in some way. I think the next several months are actually going to be critical in the way Putin thinks about this conflict going forward. Particularly because of the problems in the West in funding, because of the domestic problems we're seeing in Ukraine, the mobilization problems. He basically said, without Western support, Ukraine wouldn't last a week. He ought to be making much greater progress on the battlefield than they are at this point. So without a major breakthrough in Russia's favor on the battlefield, I think the politics inside Russia begin to shift and questions begin to be raised internally, not in public, but internally, about what are we trying to achieve by throwing away thousands of lives, a massive loss of military equipment, and we're not making any progress on the ground. That's what I would look at. I think this comes late spring, early summer, and if we're lucky, President Biden gets to make the speech in a different context.
Well, thank you. I almost take that as a note of optimism. And as my colleagues at the Miller Center know, in 2024, because there's so much uncertainty, so much doubt and anxiety, my New Year's resolution was to remain persistently optimistic, stubbornly so. But one of the reasons that I'm optimistic is the great group around this table and here at the Miller Center that makes these events happen. And particularly our terrific events team, and in this case led by Christina Lopez Guittardi Chow, whose idea was the War Room 2 years ago, but also the great AV and events team, Alfred Reeves, our whole development team, and others that help make these things happen. And then all of you for coming, for supporting the Miller Center, for joining us online. It's the educated, engaged public that makes me optimistic about where our country's going, and I want to thank you all.